right, for those of you that are joining us, welcome. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to join our webinar this evening before we have our discussion on COP26. So settle in. We'll wait for some people to arrive. Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us, welcome. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes to come into tonight's webinar, where we're going to be discussing COP26. So settle in for tonight's discussion. If you're just joining us, welcome. We're giving people a moment to come into tonight's webinar, where we're going to be discussing COP26. We'll get started in a moment. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this discussion regarding, are we still in code red? Takeaways from COP26. We're going to be breaking down the recent international meeting that took place between different world leaders regarding the climate crisis. But before we get into that, I want to talk about some introductory bookkeeping or some housekeeping information and reminders. So today's webinar will be recorded, and we will send a follow-up email in a few days, which will include a link to this recording. If we experience some technical issues, I apologize, please bear with us as we sort these things out. And we will have some time towards the end of tonight's presentation for some Q&A, but we ask that you please use the Zoom Q&A function rather than the chat to post your questions. We'll be monitoring the Zoom Q&A function throughout tonight's presentation for when we can get to answering some of our questions. So many of you may be familiar with the CLEO Institute, but for those that are new to us, welcome. We are a nonprofit organization that's nonpartisan, dedicated to climate education and advocacy. All the information that you're going to see this evening comes from a variety of trusted and vetted reputable scientific organizations and institutions, like the ones whose logos you can see at the bottom of your screen. To start off, I'd like to introduce myself. I am Ian Quarton. I'm going to be helping run the webinar that you see this evening. I am joined, of course, by Yoca Arditi-Rocha, who is the CLEO Institute's Executive Director. She is an international sustainability professional with over 15 years of experience, a biologist with a degree on corporate sustainability from the Institute of Global Sustainability at the University of Vermont, and a master's degree in liberal arts from Howard University in sustainability. She's the executive director of the CLEO Institute, where she works to drive climate action through community engagement and education. So before we get into discussing COP26 specifically, I want to put us in the right frame of mind for discussing what it is that really is the core subject of all these political actions that we hope to see movement on, which is the climate crisis. It's connected to everything that you could possibly think of. It deals with things like sea level rise, it deals with extreme heat, ocean acidification, it impacts the vulnerability of our food and water security, innumerable health impacts, increased intensity or frequency of extreme weather events, displacement of population, national security threats, not just to the United States, but to all nations, as well as biodiversity loss and economic disruptions. The climate crisis is connected to everything. And the gathering is predicated on this idea that we understand the science of this crisis. This is an updated slide. It used to read 97%, but a recent survey found that among publishing scientists and the works that they put out, there's a 99.9% or so consensus regarding this. That's global warming is increasing, the Earth's getting hotter. It's caused by human activity. These are greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane from industrial and other human behaviors, and that it is happening now. This is not a crisis that we can wait on for 10, 20, 30 years. This is something that has been ongoing for some time. And we see that these effects are already taking place across the planets. We see the headlines that are coming in on climate change helping to spark the Syrian war, according to one study. We can recall there was a terrible heat wave in France that was linked to over 1,500 deaths. And of course, we can recall the devastating wildfires that raged across the entire continent of Australia during its record drought. So what can countries do about this? Well, we have the Paris Accord, which has the goal of limiting the increase in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. It's only 30 years away, less in fact. And if you hear someone say, well, 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit, that's not that much of a temperature difference. For those of you that live with someone and have a thermostat, raise the temperature 2 degrees. See how quickly an argument comes about. And speaking of arguments, a lot of people, when discussing about what the United States needs to do and its changes and its behaviors, Some people are quick to point to China or India and remark, well, look how much greenhouse gases is coming out of China. You know, they have a whole bunch of coal-fired plants, which is true, even though they invest a lot in things like solar. But when you look at the per capita emissions of different countries, you see the United States and Canada per person emits so many tons of carbon dioxide equivalent gases that, yes, while there are these developing countries that have an opportunity to move in green directions, there is still a responsibility from the United States and those of us living in it to take action on this. What we'd like to do is to reduce these emissions in carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases until we hit net zero. What does that mean? The amount of CO2 and other gases going in the atmosphere reaches roughly the same amount that is coming out because of carbon sink processes. This would be using carbon-free electricity, decarbonization, electrifying our transportation systems, increasing our energy efficiency, and changing our farming and food habits, while at the same time, restoring our forests and soil, and investing in carbon capture and storage so that we have strong carbon sinks to prevent us from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's a bunch of ways that we can do this, which is part of the larger drawdown framework, a collection of more than 100 solutions to reverse global warming and get things back to a more stable setup. And we know these solutions. They can be implemented on the small scale or on the international scale, which is what we want to talk about in a minute. But before I pass it off to Yoca to discuss this topic, I want to leave us with this slide here, which is one of my favorite pictures regarding action on the climate crisis, because as these companies or these countries come together and decide the actions they need to take on a global scale, any naysayers that ask about the difficulties or the costs or any of the sort of other feet dragging that takes place here, this is the goal of creating a better world, not just for ourselves, but for future generations across the planet. And so I think that is something that is definitely worth working towards. So on that note, Yoca, if you are ready to share your presentation, I am ready to learn. So take it away.
Thank you, Ian. That was great. And it's one of my favorite slides as well. Yes. What if it's all a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing, right? I love that. I'm gonna stop. I guess you could stop share and I'll share mine. Ian, we can do that. Let's transition here. Can you see it? Can you see my presentation? Perfect. Okay, great. All right, so I think Ian did such a great job in setting the context of what our conversation is gonna be. But I like us to start reviewing some basic terminology and really lay the foundation for what the next few minutes is going to look like. And it all really, the title of our webinar today is, Are We Still in Code Red? And this alarm was set back in August when the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued their latest report, stating that human activity was changing the climate in unprecedented and possibly irreversible ways, and that the world was likely to hit 1.5 degrees by the early 2030s, just a few years from now. And this was an alarming report that came out only 2 months before the world would unite again at Glasgow for the COP26 climate summit. And so just to kind of set us into the conversation, some of you may know what COP may be, some of you may not, but I like to review that COP is basically the conference of parties, the mechanism that United Nations uses and has been using for the last 3 decades to bring the world together to collectively act on the climate emergency. This year was the 26th annual summit, reason why the name COP26. So in other words, the world has been uniting for 26 times to discuss on how to address the climate emergency. And So there was obviously an enormous amount of energy going into COP26. It was the first time ever since the Paris Agreement was signed back in 2015, when countries will come back to recommit their carbon pollution reductions once again to the world stage. The Paris Agreement set out and basically accorded that countries had to revise those national determined contributions, as they're called, or NDCs, every 5 years. So that meant that in 2020, the world needed to, again, come together to revise those contributions. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic and COVID-19, the efforts were postponed to 2021 and recently happened in Glasgow, Scotland, back in November. So a lot of discussion happened after COP26. Was it successful? Was it not? There was definitely a lot of deserved frustration from many groups of what the summit accomplished. And I think it really lies on the eyes of the beholder, and either you can see it the glass half empty, or you can see it glass full. You can see it with a pessimistic outlook or an optimistic outlook. What I like to do today is kind of break down things in a more realistic tone and way, if possible. But it's important to understand that the United Nations process is the only multilateral framework for negotiating at a global level the changes and policies that we need to do to revert the climate crisis. And while that speed and the kind of progress we have seen has been definitely inadequate per the United Nations report itself, we have seen some progress through this process. Now, I like to kind of put things in buckets, and I decided to do this and look at things, look at the good things, look at the bad things, and look at the ugly things. And I think that what I like to start is by saying the good thing is, the world has really averted the worst case scenario for climate warming. And that started with Paris. And it has been improved in the COP26 process as well. And I will go into a little bit more granular information and data as to how those scenarios are looking right now, based on the contributions of the countries and based on some of the pledges of different countries, specifically the most polluting countries are concerned about. So comparing to different scenarios, what we have been able to, and many organizations have been able to quantify, is that under the current policies that we have right now, and that is the second column where it says current policies, these are the policies that we have in place right now. The world, it's supposed to get to a 2.6, 2.7 kind of thresholds. Not great, but definitely not what we had back in before Paris, which was getting us closer to 4 degrees. Now for Glasgow and COP26, commitments were brought in again. And now we have a scenario that gets us to a more 2.4 degree upper kind of median threshold, with all the national determined contributions that the countries came together. Again, not great, but definitely better. And we have seen some incremental progress in that sense. Now, the last column is some net zero promises that came from countries like India, China, and the US, where they're committing to net zero carbon emissions further into the century. Some were pledges for 2050, others are pledges to 2060. The reality is, it remains to be seen if those pledges will actually happen. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, and the majority of the organizations that are looking at this are not really counting on those promises yet. Now, the commitments are there, but right now they're just commitments, they're just pledges. And none of this is important for me to say that these are binding. These are commitments that are voluntarily nonetheless. And so it's important to also acknowledge that there is uncertainty on the actual fulfillment of those commitments because countries and governments come and go and things can change. You know, recently, the United States, as you may remember, with the previous administration, pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and with the new current administration came back up. So that's one of the unfortunate flaws of the Paris Agreement, but nonetheless has set a foundation that countries have continued built upon. Now, one of the major outcomes of Paris and specifically for COP was to keep that 1.5 degree alive. When all the countries agreed back in 2015 to curb emissions and temperatures rather for 2 degrees, the emphasis was to try to keep it to 1.5 degrees. This is crucial for island countries and island nations and coastline cities and communities, because as seas continue to rise, it's important that we can curb the temperature to 1.5 degrees. So for Glasgow, it was really important that those commitments would get us to that threshold. Unfortunately, Glasgow did not provide those, or did not deliver that robust commitment as we all wanted to be. But it did provide 3 key things that will speed things up. And then the important thing, number one, was that it changed timetables. As you remember, we talked about that in Paris, it was every 5 years, countries would get together. Well, Glasgow, all countries decided that they will see each other again next year to improve those pledges once again, so they can do another check and fine tune to try to get us closer to that 1.5 degrees. So that was crucial. That was definitely a breakthrough in the commitment, and in Glasgow. Hope that we'll see with the Glasgow Pact deal, we'll see that commitment pull through in Egypt in COP27 next year. The second thing that Glasgow also delivered was that a lot of financing and arrangements and financing mechanisms were tweaked and improved. They launched different models for financing decarbonization in poor countries, which is money for adapting for the worst case of climate change. And a lot of those commitments were double. There's different pilots already in place, and if those pilots promise to be successful, we can see a lot more of those coming up next year. Also, there were some rules that were implemented to really use the carbon offset mechanism that a lot of countries have been calling for. Now, again, these are still in draft. These are still just promises and commitments. It remains to be seen if these mechanisms will actually work, or if they're actually greenwash proof. The third, and I think that to me personally was really revealing and newsworthy, is that Glasgow really allowed for a lot of commitments from different stakeholders, a lot more multilateralism, and a series of agreements came about that really translated into really meaningful commitments. And for example, 100 world leaders got together to end and reverse deforestation by 2030, including Brazil, where obviously we know is the home to the majority of the Amazon forest. The US and the UA and the EU announced a global partnership to cut greenhouse gas emissions on methane, which we all know, or at least we should know, that is one of the most heat trapping gases, greenhouse gases that needs to be tackled with to solve the climate crisis. This was a very welcoming announcement that this particular pledge was put forward. Attacking methane is one of the greatest things and greatest climate solutions that we can be looking into. Similarly, countries bound together to accelerate transition to zero emission vehicles. And also worth noting too, alliances were formed to commit to really phase out oil and gas, and to really phase out coal in some cases. Now, these were alliances, these were groups of countries that wanted to go farther, that wanted to commit a lot more. This did not mean that all countries signed onto those agreements, but these were alliances and countries that seek to do a more aggressive approach to greenhouse gas emission, and many different sectors bound together to get those forwards. So there were a lot more agreements that we won't have time to go into that, but I think the one big surprise from Glasgow was that China and the US had been patching and mending their relationships and decided in a surprise announcement to work together in this decade to limit the global temperature in 1.5 degrees. Now, we don't have many details on what that agreement may look like. What it did provide was the energy and confidence many countries needed to understand that the biggest two polluters of the country are committing and working hard to try to solve this incredible threat. Now, let's go to the bad. The NDCs and the pledges, as you can tell, were not enough. They were not enough to curb 1.5 to get us to the 1.5 degrees, and again, not enough for island nations and coastal cities. There was also no consensus in what they call loss and damage, which is basically developed countries paying developing countries for climate remediation. Basically, all the damage that a warming climate has already caused for the people that contribute the less. And back in Paris, a lot of everybody, developed countries rather, committed to get $100 billion in aid for poor countries to transition to clean renewable energy, and that has yet to be funded. Some countries had claim, COVID woes. However, there was not a clear decision in how the $100 billion in aid is going to come to about. So that's definitely something that remains on the table for COP27 next year. I think another important thing from our own local and national perspective is that the United States' role was lukewarm. President Biden needs to pass, typo there, but needs to pass his Build Back Better Act to really fulfill his pledge. And when he was in Glasgow, not even his bipartisan infrastructure bill had passed. Now we know that has passed, and that has some important climate commitments, especially in resilience. But the biggest chunk of climate funding is going to come from this piece of legislation, and that is pivotal for the United States and, quite frankly, for the world to get this through. Right now, that remains in the Senate. It passed the House, but it's sitting on it's standing between the president's desk in the Senate. Last but not least, I think something that left a really sour taste in everybody's mouth was that in the 11th hour, India and China asked to water down the face of coal language on the draft on the agreement at the last minute. That obviously it's a loophole and something that left people not in the best of terms at the end of the day. But again, promised to be revised, promised to be looked into next year at COP27. And then I think the thing that we hear the most in the news, and it's definitely the ugly, it was the COP26 was dubbed the most exclusive COP in history. In some cases, has been said the whitest COP in history. Indigenous and youth voices were particularly excluded. Few women occupy leadership positions during this COP presidency. And I think that the one that we all were very disappointed and quite frankly alert, and is that the fossil fuel industry was reported to have the biggest delegation inside COP lobbying to water down some of the regulations and some of the mechanisms that would curb greenhouse gas emissions. So, to kind of start recapping, there were some wins, and there were some winners and there were some losers. This was the first time ever that in a COP document, an agreement to phase down on fossil fuels was ever stated. It also put several important mechanisms in play, as we talked about methane, also negotiating in global carbon trading, and also the agreement of the real NDCs that brings emissions close to 45% by 2030. And that China and US climate deal is something definitely to consider a win, although again, the devil is in the details and it remains to be seen what that really will materialize into. Losses, again, rich countries are not making clear of their pledges for finance to poorer countries. Experts warn that carbon trading deal has weaknesses, meaning that it could translate to greenwashing and loopholes, and also that the vulnerable countries are not getting the funds enough to cope with some of the impacts that they're already seeing. That I think, something's clear is that we still are on track to 2.4 degree world, and that translates to tremendous climate havoc in all over the world. But definitely having reduced that language on the coal use was something that we all can consider a huge loss. Now, I wanted to be able to pause here for a minute and show you a quick video that I think it will put into even better context some of the things that we have been discussing. And I think I'm a visual person, I like visualization, and I think sometimes videos can do a much better job in communicating some of the things that we have been discussing. So I'm gonna stop share and share again with sound before that happens, because that usually does happen to all of us at one point or another. And can you hear this?
I'm not hearing audio.
Huh. Okay, let's try again.
Still not hearing audio. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either because it worked before. So we might have to skip the video just for the sake of time. I'm gonna try one more time. And if that does not work, we'll continue with the presentation. No, I think I have a problem with my own sound here because I'm not even listening to my own. So we'll come back to our presentation. How's that?
Sounds good.
Okay. Can you see my presentation, Ian?
Not yet. Not yet.
Gotta love technology.
It's amazing when it works.
All right, I started. I think my computer was glitching.
Okay. All right, I see your screen share now.
Okay, perfect. All right, so to kind of come back to my initial question, was COP26 successful? I think it's important to really go back and see where we come from. You know, Paris, when the Paris Agreement was signed, it really was a momentous moment. It was a pivotal moment. It was the first time that the world decided together, collectively, everyone, that the world needed to confront the climate crisis. Remember, this was the 21st time in meeting to try to get to that agreement. It was, you know, we had been wasting, unfortunately, precious time to really decided to tackle the climate crisis. Now, fast forward 5 years into that, and that brought us to COP26, and it's still not enough. And I think what the COP21 negotiators understood, it was we needed to move forward. We needed to get out of that stagnation, standstill, unfortunate gridlock that we had in the past, and get us moving forward no matter what. And I think that's the reason why the Paris Agreement was non-binding. There were a lot of countries that did not want to have, you know, to make this agreement a binding agreement. And so that there was compromise. And as in everything in life, not everything is linear. Progress is usually not linear. There's always bump and roads and detours, and there's always compromise. But Paris did leave us with a foundation to work on, and that's what you know, COP26 really is. It's another set of blocks. It's another layer on that foundation that we need to get us to the finish line. We still have, again, next year, COP27, and the following year, we will have COP28. And hopefully we can get to that moment where we could all see the glass full. Now, I guess the central question is, are we still in, you know, when it comes down to it, and when we come down to see all these emissions and you add all these commitments, are we still in code red? And the answer is yes, you know, we are. And we must stay in code red. We must stay in code red because we're still in a climate emergency, and the world can still increase temperature to, you know, further than 2 or 3, even 4 degrees. Remember, some of these mechanisms are still in play. They're still being drafted. Policies need to be shaped and written. There's still a lot that needs to be happening. But there's a role that we all need to play. And, you know, if there's something that we should all be striving for, is to really secure the future of younger generations. And there was, you know, if there was one group in Glasgow that really showed the discontent, the frustration, was the youth movement after this particular summit. We owe it to them. We owe them to bring them to negotiation tables, to bring them to the conversations, because we are negotiating their future. And so, you know, as a mother of 2 who does this as my lifelong mission for my young kids, you know, I always feel and see that there's something we all can do. And all of you here can play a role. This is not only the role of government. This is a role of us as citizens of this, you know, planet we call our common home. And there are many things that we can do now, particularly here in the United States. You may remember I mentioned about how pivotal the Build Back Better agenda is, specifically the act, to get us to really fulfill those commitments that the United States have pledged. And so it is up to us to demand that from our legislators, demand that from our policymakers, demand that from our elected leaders, to do more, to do better, because there is a better future that can be built. The possibilities are there, the solutions are there. We don't need to create new solutions. What we lack in the world needs to really, really turn out a hell of a bigger notch is on the will. We need to have the will to want to tackle this crisis. And the fact is that we're getting there. We're getting there slowly. This needs to be really a high speed kind of race instead of a relay kind of race. So I really hope that you take the time to call your senators and ask them to act on the climate emergency. And with that, I thank you. I know that you probably have questions. I try to cover as much as I could. It's complex stuff, but I think overall, whether to call it a success or not a success is not the question. The question is, you know, how successful we're going to be next year, and what more can we do to get us there faster. Ian, back to you.
All right, thank you very much. So we're going to go into our question and answer section. I have one question here. If you have something that you'd like to ask us, please make sure that you put it in the Q&A section. So this first question that we have here, you mentioned the US-China agreement didn't have a lot of details. Do we know when those details may come to light? I'm certainly not sure about that, so we'll have to wait and see. But what are your thoughts?
Yes, we don't know when those details are gonna come to light. I do feel that a lot is being a lot of the world is looking at the Build Back Better Act, to be honest, and I think the world is just waiting to see what's going to happen. I know that China and the US have had several conversations since the climate envoy John Kerry took over. You know, the main negotiator from China and John Kerry had been partners in the Obama administration and Paris, so they do have a relationship working in some of these agreements. But unfortunately, the relationship between the US and China has been, you know, we're fragile for other reasons. And so there's still a lot there's still, I'm sure, a lot of details that we don't know yet and are kind of waiting, depending on what happens in Congress right now, especially what happens at the Senate.
All right.
I wish I had more answers. I really don't.
Right, exactly. It is a complex issue, so we're gonna have to take a look at that and just wait and see. All right, so we have a question here, which was asked, and again, you can put your questions in the Q&A function. This person asks, if you were picked to run a future COP, what would you do to make it a better success?
I love that question. I would make it so inclusive and so diverse, and I would put a lot of women in leadership positions. The Paris Agreement was signed because of there were many women leading the way, but I would also bring in Indigenous voices and Indigenous representation, because they are the ones that have been caring for our land for, you know, years and years and years. And I would bring our youth, because our youth gets it, they understand the problem and they understand what is at stake. I think the climate crisis deserves different approaches, and we need different theories of change. There's no question that we need different theories of change. There's no one silver bullet. And I think there's not only a space for those differences, there's a need for them. There are many ways we can engage in the you know, as far as solutions are concerned, but I think that the more diverse and inclusive we can make those conversations, the better we'll be.
All right, excellent. It is the planet for all people, not just the elected officials. So again, if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A section. Okay, this question asks, I saw that oil and gas lobbyists were present at COP26. Is there anything we can do to keep them out? I'm very curious about that.
And that's a very tricky question. and I don't know if it's not a black and white answer. I think there's definitely need to be pressure, and there needs to be outrage, and there needs to be transparency in the conversations. The reality is that the time is not on our side. The scientists have been telling us we're running out of time. And for the kind of decarbonization scale that we need, we probably need the fossil fuel companies, technological expertise, infrastructure, and capacity to get us there faster. Obviously, not with fossil fuels, but with clean renewable energy. We are seeing some fossil fuel companies transitioning and making commitments to clean and renewable energy, but not fast enough. So do they need a seat on the table? I think they do, but they need to be transparent and they need to be held accountable, and there needs to be a lot of monitoring and a lot of pushback and outreach. But the reality is that it's, we need those companies that are switching to clean renewable, investing in green hydrogen, investing in more solar, investing in wind, because they have the capacity, they have the technology, and they can just, change the revenue system from an extraction fossil fuel based kind of economic system to a clean renewable system. That said, is it easier? No. Do we solve the problem by leaving them outside and not having them on the table? I don't think that's it either. I think we as consumers and we as constituents and we as voters need to demand from them that they switch and that they are transparent, so they can get there faster. We need to do it with our utilities. We need to do it with obviously all the companies that are responsible for the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions that the planet has already baked in. So not an easy answer.
No, it's not. It would be nice if we were all together on the same team, working to the same goal. A reminder, if you have a...
And in that same team, for example, in that same bucket, there are different type of companies. There are companies that genuinely are trying to switch, and there are companies that are still holding on to their old dirty ways. And again, there's not black and white. There's just a lot of shades of gray in between.
Not a simple situation. A reminder, if you have a question, you can go ahead and put it in the question and answer section rather than in the chats. While we're waiting for those to populate, I have a question that I'd like to ask you with regards to the mayor that went to represent South Florida at COP26. It was exciting to see Miami-Dade County represented, given that we're famously vulnerable to sea level rise and the climate crisis. Compared to grassroots activism and international summits like this, as a mayor, she's kind of in the middle, and I felt bridging that gap. So what do you think may be future opportunities for people to amplify their impacts and action to the worldwide scale this demands? Like, in other words, we have daily bottom-up civilian action, and we have this once a year top-down international talks. Are there chances to bridge the two?
Of course, I think there is chance to bridge the two. You mentioned the mayor, and you're talking about the county mayor, right? Not the city mayor.
Daniela Levine Cava,
yes,
who was
yes,
there.
yes. Definitely the county mayor. We have been holding the mayor accountable since she came to office. the youth movement has been holding her accountable. We helped them organize the Code Red event in Miami-Dade County. And we also, send her letters with demands. One of the demands that the youth, the collective leaders of the youth organizations here sent her was asking her to involve youth in decision-making at the county. And she agreed publicly to form a youth council advisory. Now, I think that right now is just words, not a true commitment. But again, it is up to us, and specifically to those youth leaders who she committed to hold her accountable and get back to her to make sure that they do form that youth advisory, because they will hold her feet to the fire. They will express, their discontent. The mayor announced a climate action strategy right before she went to Glasgow, where she was committing, reducing 50% of the emissions of the county by 2030, and then committing to net zero. But we all know that the county still heavily relies on the utility here, who for that to happen needs to do their own commitments and clean energy commitments. And the FPL utility does not have any clean energy commitments. So having carbon neutrality commitments and clean renewable energy commitment is a must, and that is up to us to not only hold the county accountable for making those commitments and those pledges, but at the same time, us as consumers and demanding that from our utilities as well.
So civic engagement is what I'm hearing as the primary way to bridge that gap. Currently, we have open space for further questions. We can wait a moment to see if any new thoughts populate.
And I think, we talked about accountability, and we talk about civic engagement, and, us doing everything we can in our power, and all of us have a role in this. And it's important to start local, but we can definitely play a space also at the federal and state level and at the global level. I remember when I went to COP21 in 2015, I flew from Peru, where I was living, to Paris. And that had Paris, I don't know if you remember, but it happened after the bombings, just a few days before the terrible bombings in Paris and the shootings, in Paris. And there was a lot of uncertainty. And this past COP, it was COVID. But I think all of us, all activists and advocates and members of civil society that go there, feel that purpose and that commitment, that just being there, being another soul, another body, demanding and asking for change is something that we can do. And of course, one could really talk about, flying to those COPs and all the greenhouse gas emissions that occur, isn't that the worst? And probably if we do accounting and put the balances, checks, put things on a balance, that remains to be seen. But what I'm trying to say is that we can play all sorts of role and be trying to get specifically policymakers and elected officials to do more. And we can start by just showing up at our county board of commissions here in Miami-Dade County, or just go to the state legislature or call members of Congress right now. There's definitely a lot we can all do.
All right. It looks like there's one other comment that we have in the Q&A, which is about urging the county and city mayors. This is in reference to South Florida and FP&L, to use their leverage with FP&L to demand to drop efforts to eliminate net metering. So kind of a lot of ideas mixed in there.
Yeah, and it's actually true. Right now, there is a huge effort, not only from FPL, but other utilities to eliminate net metering. And I think we should, as constituents, and we should, as residents of this county, and as consumers and customers of FPL, demand the county to use that leverage to tell them to be better and to do better. So it is up to us to push not only the mayor, but the county commission to and leverage that power to get, this is one of the biggest counties and biggest one of the biggest service areas for specifically for FPL. So we should use that collective power to get them to do better, for sure. It is up to us, no question. We can start from home, or we can go bigger and bolder. The reality is we cannot stop. We have to move forward. We have to do, whether it's small solutions that can, come to plant-based diet, to walking more, driving less, to really be mindful of our shopping habits. But at the end of the day, we're not gonna vegan our way out of this. We need regulation, and we need policy making into a cleaner, renewable, and more sustainable future and base economy. So that is up to us. That is up to us to demand it. And as a movement, until we make this a movement that at all levels of society, not just the youth movement, all of us come together, things will not speed up and not change fast enough. So that is up to us.
All right, so we got not just an international topic discussion, but also somewhat of a local involvement as well. I do want to respect everyone's time and close out with some final thoughts this evening as I go to share screen. We can close out tonight's presentation. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We encourage you to continue growing with the CLEO Institutes, where we have monthly webinars and presentations like this one. The climate crisis is such a broad topic. We could and have spent hours discussing various subtopics on different issues. We also encourage you to check out the CLEO Speakers Network. It's a program that we host a few times a year where we encourage people to learn about the science, seriousness, and solutions to the climate crisis, and become certified speakers in bringing the necessary action to their communities. And if you're a student, or if you know a student, we also encourage you to check out the Gen CLEO movement. This is our youth advocacy branch, which gets students and youth of all ages involved in tackling the climate crisis and being aware of ways that they can improve their communities. So stay tuned. We have a webinar on January the 27th that we will be hosting. More information will be forthcoming. You can find out our upcoming events on our CLEO events page. You scan the QR code that you see on the screen right now. It'll take you to that. And you can also follow us at CLEO Institute. We have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, the whole collection of social media presences. So I just want to check over and see if I'm forgetting anything, but
I do want to say something, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Since we weren't able to play the video, I have shared it in the chat, and I think that video is from The Guardian, and one of the most respected climate and environment reporters. It really summarizes the winners and losers and the good, the bad, and the ugly of COP26 in a 4-minute video. So hopefully people can watch it at home.
All right, fantastic. So I believe that concludes tonight's presentation. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy day to come and learn about the COP26 that happened this year, and of course, things that we can do to improve at the local level as well. So thanks again for joining
somebody,
us.
Hold on, they're saying they're not sharing the, hopefully that.
Is the link working?
Do you see it now?
I managed to get it open.
I think it is now.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Got
all
it.
right,
Okay.
We're good.
Thanks,
we're good.
Eric. All right. Thank you, Ian. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming and joining us. Hopefully, this was helpful. Please continue to follow us, and thank you so much for your support. I appreciate the time.
Good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.